Hey everyone, Pastor George here with today's Theolog, and today's Theolog has to do with a very important topic because it involves this Sunday, and this Sunday is Christmas Day, and as you know, Sunday is also the Sabbath and the Lord's Day, and the day that we have church most of the time. And over the past few weeks, there has been a discourse that has been going on about whether or not churches should cancel church on Sunday. And I'm sure this happens every time that Christmas falls on a Sunday, but this is my first time really being exposed to a lot of this discourse. I will say, growing up, I remember that my church never had a church on a Sunday where Christmas was going on. And so I want to start by saying, I know that every congregation is different, every context is different, and we're going to talk about kind of that in a little bit. But I'm kind of been convinced that there is not really a good reason to cancel church if it happens to fall on Christmas Day, or if Christmas Day really happens to fall on a Sunday. And we'll talk a little bit about that, why that is. But the discourse was kind of kicked into high gear this week, obviously because we're getting closer to Christmas Day. But also because the New York Times came out with an article where they were interviewing a bunch of people, and it's called "O Come All Ye Faithful," except when Christmas falls on a Sunday. And they interview a lot of different people, but the one that kind of got people the most riled up or the most interested was one where they interviewed J.D. Greear. And J.D. Greear used to be the president of the Southern Baptist Convention. And this is what the article says. It says, and it's quoting him, "Sunday is the Lord's Day, and it ought to be a day you spend with the family of Christ," said J.D. Greear, the church's pastor, who was the president of Southern Baptist Convention from 2018 to 2021. "But I don't want to be the Pharisees of this generation where I turn it into some kind of rule that there's never an exception for." He pointed to the Bible's account of Jesus healing a man on the Sabbath in defiance of local customs about proper behavior on that day. Canceling church is not a free pass to ignore the day's spiritual significance, as Mr. Greear sees it. His family will have a small worship service at home using materials provided by the church and will take a walk in their neighborhood. They will also open presents, which will include a family tradition of an envelope addressed to Jesus with a donation to a charity or the church inside. So there you have J.D. Greear saying that he's still going to celebrate it religiously, right? It seems like they're going to have family worship. Topped off by a gift that the family pools together to give to the church, right? I have no issue with any of that. I think that that's great. I think that is better than nothing. What I do kind of have an issue with is his argument as to why, that's kind of an acceptable alternative to being in church. And what he says is it's pharisaical, right? He points to the biblical account of Jesus healing a man on the Sabbath, and a lot of people get upset about this, right? This isn't the only time that this happens, right? Jesus upsets a few people about this in his ministry. We looked at it pretty recently in our sermon series that we're going through John, right? John 9 is all about how Jesus heals a guy on the Sabbath and a man born blind from birth, and how that just sets off a whole cascade of events that it involves, like him debating people about the Sabbath and how he's the Lord of the Sabbath and things like that. So that's what he says. And I think that, that would maybe have more argument if there was an argument about how church should look, or what you spend your time doing on the Sabbath and making it very regimented, right? Because I don't think that, it's a bad thing to some people will say, well, you have to do X, Y, and Z on Sundays. I think of like the Puritans where they're like, hey, you can't dance around the maypole or whatever, right? You can't play sports, or you can't you can't do these types of things also while worshiping, right, in after church or something like that. But Jesus never says, or there's never any inclination that Jesus ever told his disciples not to go to synagogue or to the temple. In fact, we see kind of the opposite, right? We see Jesus go to synagogues and temples and things like that on the Sabbath. And that would have been a normal practice, right? He doesn't tell them to neglect. And we also know that this is a practice which the early church did. But we'll get into that in a little bit. So the second thing that kind of set this off was this guy named Zach Lambert. And Zach Lambert's kind of infamous on Christian Twitter circles because he comes out with a lot of kind of far out there takes, I'll say, that if you're kind of at home in the more progressive Christian space, you'll find pretty compelling. But if you're not in that place, you're not going to find it as compelling. And so this is, he had a whole thread, but I'm going to just kind of hit the high points. So one of the things he says, people denouncing canceling church on Christmas have a fundamental misunderstanding of what church is. Church is a group of people committed to loving and following Jesus. Not gathering in a building one Sunday doesn't lessen that. In fact, sometimes it enhances it. And then he goes on to say how his church cancels church a few times a year for community service and for rest for their ministers and things like that. And so what he says is this canceling does a few things. One, it guards against the temptation to elevate Sunday gatherings as the most important expression of church. Two, it reminds us that worship and preaching are not ultimate. Jesus and people are. Three, it helps to prevent burnout for staff and volunteers. Four, it shows our community and city that we care deeply about being good neighbors, not putting on good shows. Five, it pushes back against the consumerism which dominates so many American church expressions. And six, it decenters our pastors and recenters our people. So I do not find all these things to be bad, and these are good arguments as to why, maybe we should kind of relook at the way we do church or the way we think about church, but not whether or not we hold church. So, for instance, I'm very sympathetic to the stuff about burnout, especially, he's coming from a more non-denominational evangelical background. Those groups do not have stuff like the mainline traditions do, where we have, because we've been around so long, the systems have developed in order to keep this from happening, right? I have 5 weeks of vacation. I don't need to cancel Sundays because I can just take my vacation off with session approval, right? And leave it to the church or myself to find someone to come in to cover me that day, right? So you don't have to worry about me being burned out if I take my vacation, and you can ask any of my staff that I'm very big on them using their vacation as well. And this is also why the church has rules about, that elders can only serve 6 years before they have to take a year sabbatical. Right, sabbatical, Sabbath. Right, it's meant to be in a place for people to be refreshed and to not have to worry about service. Even though lots of people are happy to serve and don't get burnt out, especially if you do a good job of balancing that. But it happens. So I think that it's good to help prevent burnout. I do not think that canceling service is a way you do that. Right, you actually just end up putting in place rules where people aren't burnt out. But that's harder to do and harder to sell people on, especially because a lot of congregations can view their ministers as their slaves almost. And so that's a hard sell for a lot of people. But it shouldn't be. That is a good thing, right? And again, church is not about putting on a good show. It's not about the pastor, definitely not, right? And I think that if that's part of the reasoning, these are all good reasons to rethink about how you do church. But the problem is it doesn't actually get to the problem of the issue, right? Which is that Sunday is a day of rest set aside by God for the purpose of worship. And that worship has been done all the time in a body, in a gathering of believers, in a place, in a house. It doesn't have to be in a church building, right? I think if you wanted to do this in a way that you could honor these concerns, you could do small home group meetings or something like that. But you certainly shouldn't cancel church, right? There should be pastors there who are praying and leading worship and preaching to people and things like that. If you don't want to do this whole big spectacle, that's fine, but you don't need to cancel church. And as far as Sunday gatherings being the most important expression, right, that's kind of a loaded thing because anyone can problematize that, right? If you say, hey, it's really important that you go to Sunday worship, it's the most, that's when we all gather together, worship God, they'll be like, well, it's more important than feeding the homeless, right? It's a false dichotomy that a lot of people can present. The important thing is that we are gathering together to worship, and you can set aside other times to do that. It's very important that the body of Christ gathers, and this is something that goes back to the New Testament, right? So Acts 27, right? This is from the book of Acts. It says, on the first day of the week, Luke is writing in the first person, we came together to break bread. Paul spoke to the people because he intended to leave the next day and kept on talking until midnight. And then a funny story happens where a guy falls asleep, falls out the window, and dies or whatever. And Paul brings him back. But there you see that he's referencing a practice that goes back to the apostles, which is on the first day of the week, which is the day that Jesus was resurrected, which is a Sunday. People would gather together and break bread, right? Because that's the time that a lot of these things happen. Now, there might be good excuses as to why not to do that. And that's, why I don't take an attendance every Sunday, right? Unless you've kind of not been there for a while. But I do not assume that you're just skipping out of malice or neglect, although I'm sure that happens. But this is why it's important, right? It's not, you don't do it because of any self-fulfillment or whatever. You do it rather because this is the practice of the church and the things that have been going on, right? This is the time when we're actually able to do a lot of these things, like sharing our burdens, sharing our joys and our sorrows, and hearing the word of God and being grown in that way. And that's not something that I've ever seen effectively done outside of this. And I think COVID is a really good example of why this is important. I think that basically every single minister I've talked to has agreed that online worship is not the same as in person, and it will never capture that. There's something about being together that is an impossible thing in worshiping God. It also points out that the point of this is not us, right, but to worship God. And the familial gathering is a secondary of that objective. So, and of course, this goes back to the Ten Commandments, right? Remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy. That I'm sure you all know about. So one of the things that I saw, probably the best argument, because you'll notice like J.D. Greear didn't really use a good biblical example. Zach Lambert, unsurprisingly, did not use a very good biblical example. But one of the people that did was a article that was written for the Gospel Coalition by a guy named Fletcher Lang, and he's a pastor of a church plant up in Boston. And he basically says why he and his church canceled Christmas because of context. That area is very secular. People are transient. They're not going to have a high turnout. And a lot of people who complain are always talking about the turnout. I think that's why my church growing up didn't do it, because they were worried about turnout. And I want to just say on that really quickly is that I don't care. Like, for us, it shouldn't be about turnout. We should worship no matter what, right? I think what's important, what's a reminder, what churches need to remember is that it's not on us to try and attract as many people as possible and make it as convenient and easy for them as is needed, and things like that, because why have worship on a Sunday anyway? Why not do it on another day? Things like that. You could easily just say, hey, let's make all of these concessions in order to get as many people inside our walls as possible. And at the end of the day, people need to put God first in their lives, right? That's what needs to happen. And if they're not going to, then it's on us to correct that behavior, but it's not on us to try and bow down and kowtow to that type of thing. But anyway, what he says here is, he says, listen, we rent a public place. It's hard to find, these places are closed on Christmas Day. It's hard to get places to open. We have to do a lot of setup, and the payoff for that is not a lot of people show up, and that's disheartening and difficult for us. And he sees that, he makes a plea to support pastors. He says, listen, it's Christmas. It's just not. It's important to do this. But the reason he gives for his argument biblically for it is he looks at Romans 14, 5 through 7. And that says, one person esteems one day as better than another, while another esteems all days alike. Each one should be fully convinced in his own mind. The one who observes the day observes it in honor of the Lord. The one who eats, eats in honor of the Lord, since he gives thanks to God, while the one who abstains, abstains in honor of the Lord and gives thanks to God. For none of us lives to himself, and none of us dies to himself. So in Romans 14, Paul is talking about more broadly the freedom that Christians have. And one of the things that he is beginning with is the weak and the strong, right? And he says that, the Roman, he doesn't say the Roman church. He says churches generally quarrel over things that are disputed. So one person, a good example of this, one person thinks it's fine to eat food that is sacrificed to idols. Another person doesn't think it's fine to do that. And Paul says, this isn't a salvation issue. You guys should just be able to do your own thing and not worry about the other person. But if it's in a mixed gathering, kind of defer to the person that is the weaker brother, right? That's what he says. And so here he gives examples of some spiritual practices that people have, where some people will honor some days as more sacred than others. And another person considers every day alike. And actually, that's a really good example for Christmas, because you'll have some people that say Christmas, regardless of what day it falls on, you need to have a church service. So if it's a Tuesday, you're having a church service on Tuesday. That is actually where you would apply this and say, no, you don't have to do that, right? The problem is that this is not talking about Sundays, all right? This is not saying that the Sabbath isn't important, right? Paul doesn't teach that. That is something that is outside of the tradition completely. And so to say that this applies to just saying, hey, we shouldn't have church on Sunday, because you could just say, hey, we shouldn't have church on Sundays. Let's have church instead on Wednesdays, because that's most convenient for me in my schedule, right? And that's not a good reason. Maybe there would be situations where that is a good reason. So let's say there might be a few contexts that's good. So let's say that you're in a persecuted country and the church, people look out for the church on Sundays and they'll kill people who show up or something like that, right? This is a very exceptional circumstance. Then you could say, yeah, Wednesday is the day that we're going to mark as holy and put it aside because the Lord commanded us to keep the Sabbath. But saying, oh man, I'm really worried about attendance. I don't want anyone, I don't want to be discouraged after setting up and only, 10 or 15 people coming. I'm not going to have church. That's not a good reason, right? And people in those situations still meet on Sundays when they know they're going to be targeted and things like that. So if that's not a good excuse, then nothing else really is for why we shouldn't hold church. And so it's something I've become more convinced of in light of COVID and things like that. But yeah, this is a big deal. One of the things that we have to remember, and I don't think this is a bad guy. If I was in his shoes, I wouldn't have canceled. What I would have done is I would have tried to do some home worship or something like that. Pare it down. Not everything needs to be a big production. And just be able to worship together. If you don't have the space, right? Have an apartment or something. My apartment isn't big, but we could probably have a decent gathering here, and it would be fun or whatever. So anyway, that's what I wanted to talk about. You guys should all be in church on Sunday. If you're not with us, then you're traveling, then at another church. But we really should, not because it's Christmas Day, but because it's the Lord's Day, and that's what we do. We gather together on the Lord's Day. So thank you, everyone, for hey, again, for me, if you just me personally, right? It's more convenient for me not to have church. I don't have to prepare another sermon. I get to sleep in. I get to enjoy a lot of stuff if we don't have church on a Sunday, okay? So it's not just anyone being quote-unquote inconvenienced by this, right? I would be inconvenienced if I actually believed it was an inconvenience to worship, which it's not. So believe me, this isn't self-centered at all. This is just teaching biblical truth. So I'll see you guys on Sunday. I'll see you guys tomorrow for our Bible study recap and our Mailbag Thursdays. And I hope all of you have a wonderful rest of your Tuesday. Peace out.